When we think about Gothic literature, we often imagine haunted castles, monsters, vampires, and ghosts. But the true origins of Gothic horror are far more personal. The greatest Gothic writers of the Romantic era did not invent darkness out of thin air. They transformed their own experiences of grief, abandonment, rejection, and family conflict into literature. Tonight we will explore how family trauma shaped the creative minds of Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Polidori, and Claire Clairmont. We will see how the monsters they created reflected emotional wounds they carried throughout their lives. The famous summer of 1816 occurred during what historians call the year without a summer. Following the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, global temperatures dropped dramatically. Storms and cold weather trapped Byron and his guests indoors at Villa Diodati, near Lake Geneva. To entertain themselves, they challenged one another to write ghost stories. The result would permanently change literature. Mary Shelley conceived Frankenstein. Polidori developed ideas that became The Vampyre. Byron's influence helped shape the archetype of the dark, brooding antihero. Yet these stories were not simply products of imagination. They emerged from the emotional realities of the people gathered around that fireplace. Gothic literature explores emotional extremes. Unlike traditional horror, Gothic fiction is not merely about frightening events. It is about psychological wounds. The monsters are often symbolic representations of emotional struggles. The Gothic imagination asks difficult questions. What happens when a child is abandoned? What happens when grief becomes unbearable? What happens when identity begins to collapse? The writers at Villa Diodati repeatedly returned to these themes because they had lived them. Mary Shelley entered the world through tragedy. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, one of history's most influential feminist philosophers, died just days after giving birth. Imagine growing up knowing your existence was connected to the death of someone celebrated throughout Europe. Mary never knew her mother personally, yet spent her life trying to live up to her memory. Her father, William Godwin, loved her deeply but demanded intellectual excellence. This combination of admiration and emotional distance became a recurring pattern throughout Mary's life, and eventually appeared in her fiction. One of the most heartbreaking passages in literary history appears in Mary's journal after the death of her infant daughter. She recorded a dream in which the child returned to life after being warmed beside a fire. Years later, readers would encounter Victor Frankenstein bringing life to dead flesh through science. The connection is difficult to ignore. Frankenstein is often described as a story about scientific ambition. But at its emotional center, it is a story about grief and the impossible desire to reverse death. Percy Shelley spent much of his life fighting against the future his family had planned for him. His father valued status, reputation, and political respectability. Percy valued radical ideas, personal freedom, and intellectual revolution. The resulting conflict was severe. He was disowned financially and condemned socially. This tension between creator and creation mirrors one of Frankenstein's most powerful relationships: the rejection of a child by its parent. The emotional wounds of family conflict became literary themes. Byron often seemed like a Gothic character who stepped out of one of his own poems. His father abandoned the family and squandered their fortune. His mother alternated between affection and emotional abuse. As a child, Byron's clubfoot made him deeply self-conscious. These experiences shaped the Byronic hero, a figure characterized by pride, guilt, loneliness, and self-destructive tendencies. When Byron wrote tormented heroes, he was often writing autobiographically. His poetry became a way of transforming inherited pain into legend. Polidori's position within the Villa Diodati circle was unique. He was highly educated and ambitious, but lacked Byron's status and fame. Byron often treated him dismissively. Letters and diary entries reveal how deeply these slights affected him. Polidori spent much of his short life trying to prove his worth. His frustrations eventually became fuel for one of literature's most important monsters. The vampire we recognize today owes much to Polidori. His character, Lord Ruthven, was largely modeled after Byron. The vampire was not merely a supernatural predator. He was a social predator. He seduced, manipulated, and destroyed the people around him. Through fiction, Polidori transformed his personal frustrations into cultural mythology. His vampire became the foundation for later works, including Bram Stoker's Dracula. Claire Clairmont is frequently treated as a footnote to history. Yet her life contains many of the same Gothic themes found in the works of her contemporaries. After her relationship with Byron ended, he took custody of their daughter Allegra and placed her in a convent. The child died at only 5 years old. Claire's letters afterward reveal overwhelming grief. Like many women of the era, she was punished socially for actions that enhanced the reputations of men. She became one of the hidden tragedies behind the Gothic movement. A fascinating pattern emerges when we compare the lives of these individuals with their creative works. Their monsters are rarely random inventions. Instead, they reflect emotional realities. The creature longs for acceptance. The vampire manipulates relationships. The Byronic hero struggles against guilt and isolation. These literary figures function almost like emotional fingerprints left behind by their creators. As genealogists, we study more than names and dates. We study patterns, family systems, inherited experiences, social environments. The lives of these writers demonstrate how family history influences identity and expression. Their stories remind us that ancestry is not simply biological. It is emotional, cultural, and psychological. The Gothic imagination emerged from generations of lived experience. Today, psychologists discuss intergenerational trauma. Researchers study how emotional wounds can influence future generations. The Romantics lacked this vocabulary. Instead, they described inherited suffering through stories of curses, haunted families, and doomed bloodlines. Different language, same observation. The past never truly disappears. It echoes through families and sometimes through literature. The lives of these writers ended tragically and often prematurely, yet their stories did not. Frankenstein's creature still walks through popular culture. The vampire remains one of literature's most enduring monsters. The Byronic hero appears in novels, films, and television series today. Their personal suffering became cultural inheritance. Their monsters became immortal. When we examine the lives of Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Polidori, and Claire Clairmont, we discover that Gothic horror begins not with monsters but with people. People who suffered, people who grieved, people who transformed personal pain into stories powerful enough to survive centuries. Their bloodlines produce not only descendants but ideas. And those ideas continue to shape how we understand horror, creativity, and the enduring influence of family history.